Live. Live.
All right, so we are here, East Hall Middle School, 8th grade Georgia Studies, 5th period classes, and Mr. Steve Oney, author of And the Dead Shall Rise. And what we were wanting to talk to you about at the beginning, well, we actually wanted you to share with us your experiences with the Frank case. A lot of our students here are very interested in the Frank case, and so would like to know your experiences with it, and then they have some questions if there's time at the end. So please take it away.
Well, thank you all so much. It's really an honor and a pleasure, and I'm so pleased that you invited me and that your teacher, Ms. Farr, came to hear me speak in Marietta this summer, and that she was sufficiently impressed to arrange this conversation here several months later. The Leo Frank case is extraordinarily fascinating, strange, puzzling. It kept me tied up in curious knots for about 15 years, so hang on to your hats. That's a long time to work on something, and I worked on my book about that long. Now, I won't say that I worked on it all the time. I wrote magazine articles and newspaper stories to make a living as I was working on the book, but it took me that long to figure it out and then to get it onto paper. And I got interested in the case when an old gentleman who, as a teenager, about your age, a 14-year-old, came forth very late in his life to say he had seen something on the day that Mary Phagan was murdered, and that he had kept it inside him for 70 plus years. He was 85 years old, and that he wanted to make a clean breast of his conscience and say what he saw. And what he said he saw was that a black man named Jim Conley was actually the killer of Mary Phagan. He didn't see Jim Conley kill 13-year-old Mary Phagan, but he saw Jim Conley carrying Mary Phagan's body. So this man came forth with this startling revelation, really a deathbed revelation. He didn't have much longer to go in his life, and I went to the Veterans Administration Hospital outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, where he was living, and interviewed him and wrote an article for Esquire magazine about his late in life revelations. And it was a pretty good article, and I worked quite hard on it, worked several months on it, and Esquire devoted an awful lot of space to it. And when the article appeared in print, I did what nonfiction writers do. I wrote a proposal and had my agent circulate it to book publishers in New York in the hope that one would assign me, would advance me some money to write the real book about the Leo Frank case. And luckily enough, someone did make an offer, and it wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough to keep me from going to the poorhouse. So I plunged in and started to work on what became And the Dead Shall Rise. And had I known at the time I started that it was going to take more than 15 years, I probably would have stopped right there. But sometimes it's better not to know how tough the task you have ahead of you is. And you just plunge in with blind faith and confidence and belief that you'll finish, and that you hope will carry you through the tough times. And that's what I did. And what really carried me through was my complete absorption in the story and my realization that it was just so fascinating, and that you could tell the whole story of Georgia in the early part of the 20th century through this one case, that it provided a lens that brought everything in the larger picture into a kind of focus, and that you could write about race, you could write about men and women, you could write about crime, you could write about society, you could write about rich and poor, you could write about industry, you could write about a world changing, and that you could tell it all through a story. And the story was a murder story. And I would, when people asked me what I was doing, I would say I'm writing a double murder mystery and a social history. And the double murder mystery, the two whodunits, were who murdered Mary Phagan and then who lynched Leo Frank. And the social history was all those things I just mentioned as kind of a preamble, how those two crimes were so electrifying that they brought everything into Georgia that was usually under wraps and not very out in the open, brought it into relief so you could see it for what it was. And, you know, most of us muddle through life and we don't see the big picture. And there are occasions when some clarifying event occurs, Sometimes it's a tragedy. Sometimes it's just a moment of insight. And that clarifying event brings the world briefly into focus. And as I saw it, the Leo Frank, Mary Phagan case brought the world of the South into focus. And like you, I grew up in the South. I went to high school in DeKalb County, Peachtree High School. I went to the University of Georgia. I worked for the Atlanta newspapers back when they were independent, competitive newspapers in the 1970s. And then I moved to California. And even though I was in California, I was convinced that I wanted to write something about Georgia, that I had spent all that time there, all that formative time when I was your age. And, these are really your formative years. You're really these are the years that are making you who you will be. And I was the same way. When I was your age, I was being shaped. And so I thought that's a much more profound heritage and something really worth spending time on than whatever I was getting involved in California. So I just plunged into deep water and hoped that I could swim. And, I'd been around the block a few times. I was a veteran magazine writer who'd written for just about every major magazine and major newspaper in the country. And so I knew, I was confident that I had the basic skills, but I had no idea how overwhelming a task it was. And, to give you a sense of how overwhelming it was, the Leo Frank lynching is a profoundly complicated crime. It was a perfect crime. No one was ever punished for it, other than losing a night of sleep. No one was really inconvenienced. And so I thought in my perhaps overconfidence that I could get to the bottom of it. And I didn't go at it in any kind of angry way, like I was going to prosecute the guilty all these years later. I just wanted to understand what happened. And, there was a reason why no one had figured this out for 100 years. And, it took me a lot of banging my head against the wall and talking to people and spending time in archives and reading old papers and documents before I could even begin to make the most elementary sense of it. So it was there's a Yiddish word called schlep, and schlep means a long haul. So this book was a schlep. That's kind of how I got into it. I'm happy to talk about any particular parts of it. I'm happy to talk about anything at all, anything that you're curious about the case, about my work, about the time I spent on the work. I will tell you, my wife, who's very funny, she would refer to herself as I was toiling away on this as the bride of Leo Frankenstein. And, she was none too happy that I was caught up in this mad pursuit to get to the bottom of this. I mean, she was proud of me and happy that I was working on something that was fulfilling, but it became kind of a monster in our house, something I really had to deal with. And the only way to deal with the monster is to go deal with it. And when you're writing a book, there was a wonderful monologuist named Spalding Gray who did a monologue called Monster in a Box. And what he meant was the monster was the book he was working on, and it was in a manuscript box where the pages were stacking up. And, when you're writing a book, it really is a kind of monster. You gotta deal with it. You gotta finish it. And the only way to finish it is to finish it. I don't know how many of y'all are athletic, but if you're on the football team, you got to go play the game. And if you're a writer, you got to go finish your book. You got to finish your work, because nothing ever finishes itself. And I'm sure you all have, know the kind of dread when you're assigned a theme just to write 2 or 3 pages. The manuscript of my Leo Frank book was, about 1,000 pages. And so it was dread all the time. Like, how do you do the work? The only way you do the work is you just quietly sit down and do it. Anyway, sorry to bring you down. I'm actually very happy I did the book. I can't think of any better way to have spent that time. And, I feel good about what I accomplished. And as someone who I didn't know I wanted to be a writer when I was your age, but by the time I was 18, I was pretty sure I wanted to be a writer. So to, do what I set out to do gives me a certain sense of fulfillment. But it was hard work. But the case is so fascinating. I mean, we can talk about my process and my the times I was dedicated, the times that I was lazy and played hooky. I mean, all those things were there. But the case itself is what is so interesting. Those are my dogs you might hear in the background. They probably would like to correct what I'm saying. But ask me some questions or tell me some parts of the story that you're fascinated by, and I can, delve in and maybe pull back the curtain and show you a little about what's behind it.
I think a couple of the universal questions that I saw on most papers would be, who really killed Mary Phagan and who really killed Leo Frank, and how did you come to the conclusions that you came to? So they want definite answers in the instant gratification Google world, and you might have shocking answers for them.
Okay, I'll give you my best shots, but before I do, let me just say that when you do a book like this, you realize that nothing online is trustworthy, and you can't find any of the real information you need by doing a Google search. You have to go to an archive for the handwritten letters and the court documents and the material that nobody is ever going to scan, or nobody has ever scanned it yet, where all that stuff resides. And you have to just sit your tail down at a desk and plow through that stuff. And that's where the story comes from. You can Google Leo Frank and you can, get a sense of what it was, but you can't really find out the answers to who murdered Mary Phagan and who lynched Leo Frank. But we'll start with the lynching first. I thought the lynching was going to be the hardest problem, but it ended up being easier to solve than the question of who killed Mary Phagan. The lynching was a community action undertaken by the leading citizens of Marietta. And Mary Phagan had grown up in Marietta. Her family was an old Cobb County family. And the leading citizens of Marietta decided they were going to avenge her death. And it wasn't quite that simple. Many of the leading citizens of Marietta were political enemies of Leo Frank's friends. By the time the case had gotten to the point where they decided to lynch Leo Frank, it had been going on for 2 years, and people were completely crazed out of their mind. And the rhetoric and the conversation was just as vicious and just as poisonous as anything you would hear on cable news today, even more so. And a brief sidelight: people think they live in a total immersion world of media today. Well, people lived in a kind of immersive world 100 years ago, except it was different. It wasn't electronic media, it was newspaper journalism. There wasn't even any radio at the time of the Leo Frank case, but the Atlanta newspapers, there were 3 competitive newspapers, and they would publish multiple extras a day. So it'd be like a refreshed website every hour. There'd be a new edition of the paper with kids selling them on the street. And because most people didn't travel by cars, they would travel by trolley or by train. Everybody would be reading the latest and the newest as they were coming to work or going home. So people were completely overwhelmed by the coverage of the Leo Frank case. But by the time Leo Frank was lynched, this was the only subject on the minds of anyone in Georgia, and really anyone in the United States. It had become a gigantic nationwide event, largely because a number of powerful Atlanta Jews, and Leo Frank was Jewish, had gone to New York and solicited the aid of some very powerful New York and national media figures who happened to be Jewish, and they started publicizing the dilemma of Leo Frank. And there was a backlash in Georgia. You have to think back in time. In 1915, Georgia was closer to the Civil War than we are today to World War II. So there was still a great deal of sectional animosity and hostility in the South. grievances about being a defeated nation, defeated by this powerful, distant northern capitalistic force. The South was still very much an agrarian society. Anyway, these powerful people in Marietta, 5 or 6 of the biggest names in Marietta, got together and decided they were going to execute Leo Frank. And they were angry because of not only the protests up north, but because Leo Frank's death sentence had been commuted by the governor of Georgia, a man named John Slayton. And if you're ever in Buckhead in Atlanta and are driving around off Paces Ferry Road, you'll see a beautiful street called Slayton Avenue, and that's where the Slayton family had their mansion. It was quite a rich family, and John Slayton was married to a woman named Sally Grant, and that was a rich family too. Grant Park, where the Atlanta Zoo, where the cyclorama is, that was their family. So the people of Cobb County really resented that these powerful Northerners and some rich and influential Atlanta business folks and politicians had saved Leo Frank's life, and they decided they were going to put an end to Leo Frank's life, and they organized this extraordinary, daring mission to abduct Leo Frank from the state prison, which was in Milledgeville at the time, and lynch him in Marietta. They abducted him from the state prison around midnight and drove him all the way back to Marietta and lynched him at dawn the next day. And that doesn't sound like much of a trip by contemporary standards, but it was a hugely ambitious undertaking in 1915 when most cars had inflatable tube tires and almost none of the roads were paved, and you could travel a maximum of 25 or 30 miles an hour on these dirt roads, mostly between cotton fields and cornfields. And the group brought Leo Frank back from Milledgeville and hanged him at dawn in Marietta. And if you know the town of Marietta, the site is very near the Big Chicken, the Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant on US 41 in Marietta. It's a hilarious thing if you haven't seen it. There's a big red chicken on top of the big constructed red chicken on top of the restaurant, and its lips move back and forth. So that absurd landmark today is where Leo Frank was lynched, and they got away with it. They lynched him at dawn, and then they just disappeared into the woodwork, and none of them was ever prosecuted, and it was a perfect crime. So, for 80 plus years at the time I was working on my book, no one had written about it. It was, the names were whispered in Marietta. There's a saying, the elephant in the room. It's a saying that means a truth that everybody knows about, but no one will speak of, no one will articulate. And the truth about the lynchers, the Leo Frank lynchers in Marietta, that was the elephant in the room in Marietta. And so I set out to try to identify who these lynch party members were. And I was very lucky. I made friends with quite a few older people who were extremely patient and didn't throw me out when I asked rude questions. And I didn't really ask rude questions. One of the great lessons of doing this work is that you can ask people difficult questions if you're polite. If you are earnest and you say, I just want to know, and if you even throw yourself on their mercy and say, will you help me? It's almost like asking for directions when you're lost. Will you help me? And when you're a reporter, you are kind of lost because you're trying to explore unfamiliar territory that you don't really know that much about. And if you're polite and if you're persistent and if you take yourself and your job seriously, a lot more people will help you than you could imagine. And so I was polite and persistent, and I also set out really to meet just about everyone in Cobb County 80 years old or older, anyone who might remember anything about it. And that sounds crazy, but I talked to dozens of people in their 80s and early 90s. I met 3 people who were actually at the lynch site and saw Leo Frank's body hanging there. They were teenagers about your age or a little older. Some of them had ridden their bicycles out. Leo Frank was lynched at dawn, and by 8:30 in the morning, there were several thousand people gathered around his body, and it was a horrific, terrible scene. And some of them were luckily still alive when I started working. I also did, I wasn't just jumping higgledy-piggledy into this. I went to the state archives and I got the auto registration records for Marietta and Cobb County in 1915. And there were 7 cars used in the lynching, and there were only a couple hundred registered automobiles in Cobb County back in those early days. So I got a list of the ownership of all the cars, and then I started, putting together a list of what cars might have been involved in the 7 that went down to Marietta. I read the society pages of the newspapers to see who socialized with whom, and who attended one another's parties and weddings, and who really ran Marietta. And then I had 3 or 4 quite well-connected people in Marietta who took me in hand and helped me along. And I would go back and meet with them regularly and say, here's what I've learned. What does it mean? And one of these fellows was the associate editor of the Marietta paper, and his uncle had been in the lynch party. And another was a woman who had a beauty salon on the square in Marietta, and her dad had been in the lynch party. And, they very patiently helped me put together not just a list of names, but who these people were and how they related to one another and what their different motives were, and what their lives were like, and what impact this lynching had. Because while none of them was prosecuted, it had an impact on all of them, and some sloughed it off. Some experienced terrible guilt and anxiety about it for the rest of their lives. So their reactions and their motivations were as different as those you'd find among any people. But after a long, long period of labor on this, I was very, very certain of who did it, and very certain of how they did it, and very certain of what the rest of their lives were like. And, when I was finished with my book, I gave my papers to the Georgia Historical Society, which is in a beautiful old library down in Savannah. And, there were 25 moving boxes full of papers. And, the notes, I took it seriously. I thought, I'm about to name some names of these people who did this. And I want to make sure that I can look at anyone, a son, a daughter, a grandson, and if they take offense to what I've written, I want to be able to say, I understand, but this is just the truth, and here's how I support it, and here's how I got to it. So I took the task seriously. The Murder of Mary Phagan, which started this all off, is much murkier, and I would think that you all identify with Mary Phagan quite a bit. She was 13 years old. She had been working since she was 10. She had attended the first couple grades of elementary school. Child labor was an accepted fact in life in Georgia 100 years ago. Teenage kids, unless they were wealthy, had no expectation of completing high school. They went to work, and they went to work in cotton mills, in Mary Phagan's case, in a pencil manufacturer. And it was a big industrial concern that made hundreds of thousands of pencils a week. This wasn't some sort of boutique that turned out, a few handsome pencils every week. This was a mass production factory run with modern management techniques. And Mary Phagan was 13 years old and had been laboring to help her family since she was 10. So the factory worked almost entirely on child labor. There were about 150 employees, and 120 or so of them were teenage kids, and most of them young girls. And so the managers were all slightly older men in their 20s, and the parents of the young girls were concerned about sending their children into this kind of environment to make a living, but the families needed money, and on some level, it was good for the kids. It gave them a sense of accomplishment and independence and got them out of the house. But there was a surface level of tension and a fear on the part of the parents. Would the managers of the factory take advantage of these young 13, 14, 15-year-old girls working for 25-year-old guys? And when Mary Phagan was found murdered in the pencil factory, it brought all these anxieties among the parents and among everyone else really in Atlanta to the surface. But it was another kind of elephant in the room, because everyone in Atlanta, while they said child labor was a good thing, everyone knew on a deeper level that it was a very bad thing, that these young lives were being, they weren't being taken, but they were being, the kids had no chance of personal fulfillment of the sort that all of us now take for granted, and that, you all, just by being in school today, if it was 100 years ago in Atlanta and your parents were not doing that well, you too might be working in a big factory. And that is hard to conceive of, but that was standard operating procedure 100 years ago. So Mary Phagan was found murdered, very badly beat up, most likely raped. The medical evidence is a little murky. And Leo Frank, her 29-year-old Cornell-educated supervisor, the supervisor of the entire factory, a very smart, powerful guy, he was the last person to admit having seen her alive. It doesn't mean he was the last person to see her alive, but he was the last person to admit it. And he told the police that Mary Phagan had dropped in his office on the day of the killing to pick up her wages, and that he gave them to her, and no one else ever spoke to her or ever admitted speaking to her again. So he became the immediate suspect, and he was convicted largely on the testimony of a black janitor at the factory who, I'm making a long story short, but this black guy named Jim Conley said that Leo Frank was taking advantage of the young girls who worked in his factory, and that Jim Conley would serve as his lookout, his accomplice. And Jim Conley said that Leo Frank killed Mary Phagan after she resisted his romantic advances. And an all-white jury in 1913 believed Jim Conley's testimony, it believed a black man's testimony over Leo Frank's story, and convicted Leo Frank of murder, and the judge sentenced Leo Frank to death by hanging. And it was this sentencing that was, in this conviction, it was appealed for 2 years. And at the end of those appeals was when Governor John Slayton, who I mentioned a moment ago, commuted Leo Frank's death sentence. And that's when the people in Cobb County decided, we're going to take justice into our own hands, and we're going to hang this guy. And even if we have to organize this very daring raid on the state prison, and it really is unimaginable if you think of it today. I don't know who the most famous prisoner in the state of Georgia is at this moment, but if he's being held in Reedsville or a state facility someplace in Georgia, and a group broke into the prison, kidnapped him, and drove him 150 miles and killed him the next day, that would be an astonishing thing. And this was an astonishing thing, and people were flabbergasted. As to who did it, I think Jim Conley killed Mary Phagan, and that he was a very clever guy, and he figured out a way to play the police and the prosecuting attorney and convince them that the bigger fish, Leo Frank, the factory manager, did it. And Jim Conley was, unlike a lot of blacks of his era, he had had some schooling. He initially said he couldn't write. He professed that he was ignorant and a fool, but he was not at all ignorant. He was literate and was clever, and had learned how to navigate in the tough world, the tough racist world of Atlanta in 1913. And he realized that this was the hand that had been dealt him, and that he was going to convince these officers that Leo Frank did it, because if he didn't, he would be hanged for the crime. And he pulled it off. And, there's some outside chance that Leo Frank might have done it. We never really will know, because none of us was there. And even with all the hard work I did, the truth is often gray as opposed to black and white. So I leave the door slightly open about Leo Frank's guilt, but I'm 99% convinced that Jim Conley did it. And he did it not necessarily for a sexual motivation. He robbed Mary Phagan of her pay. She had just been to Leo Frank's office to get her pay, which was handed out in an envelope full of dollar bills and change. And he saw her emerge from Leo Frank's office carrying her pay envelope, and he just jumped her and took it, and he killed her. And then he made this phenomenal story that Leo Frank did it stick. And Leo Frank was kind of a nervous, wooden guy. He lived in his head. He was very smart, but he lacked the humor and the grace, and he wasn't a good old boy. He wasn't. He didn't win friends. He was a chess playing Yankee who was much more comfortable tabulating figures, and he was very much a modern company guy. And Jim Conley was a hilarious storytelling jokester who, even though he was black working in a racist world, he had much more in common with the white lower class and middle class people on the jury, and who were most of Atlanta was comprised by these kind of people. So he was a much better witness and much more winning. But that doesn't mean he was telling the truth. He was just a more effective advocate than Leo Frank was. As for who lynched Leo Frank, it was these 5 or 6 really powerful people in Marietta who put it together, and then they recruited a number of less powerful people. The 5 or 6 who did it, one was a former governor, one was a state legislator, one was the solicitor, meaning the district attorney for Cobb County, and they put this plan together, and then they picked 25 farmers, merchants, electricians, auto mechanics. They picked some regular guys who were handy and good with their hands and good with guns. They picked them to get in the cars and go down to Milledgeville and abduct Leo Frank. And the names of the people who did it, when my book came out, it made front page news in the Atlanta papers because it was a big deal to name who did this. And as you drive around Georgia, you'll see their names. If you're over in Athens at the University of Georgia, there's a girls' dormitory on campus called Brumby Hall. The Brumby family was involved in the lynching of Leo Frank. There's a Joe Brown Hall at the University of Georgia. That family was involved. When I went to college at the University of Georgia. When I was at the journalism school there, the head of the alumni office, his family was involved in it. So, these were powerful families, and the names mean less and less as the years go by. But when you think about what it took to get someone out of a state prison, this was not a easy undertaking. They walked into a state prison without firing a shot and abducted the most famous convict in America, and then drove him in the dead of night across about 150 miles of Georgia countryside and lynched him. And to pull something off like that, you need leverage, you need influence, you need powerful allies. And so it was when it was all over, the whole thing was so terrifying to everyone that people essentially stopped talking about it. It went from being page 1 news, the subject on everyone's lips, to being something so astonishing, so terrifying that people just clammed up. And for the next 50 or 60 years, the subject of Leo Frank's lynching really wasn't talked about in the state of Georgia. Anyway, that's my kind of short answer about who did it. Next.
All right. Who wants to ask Mr. Oney a question? All right, Cindy, you can face the camera. They're a little nervous.
Hey, Cindy, don't be nervous. I'm more nervous than you are.
Hi, Mr. Oney.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
I'd like to know if you think that Jim Conley's lies were believable.
Well, the jury did believe him. I mean, and it was it's a good question. The weird thing is, back in those days, people thought that Black people were liars. That was the common understanding. And so Jim Conley told some lies, and then he told some more lies, and then he started telling what people in Georgia thought was the truth. So the development of his story fit into what white Georgians thought was a pattern, an acceptable pattern of how Black people got to the truth. Jim Conley himself, to use language that you couldn't use today, but when asked how he felt after he told his story, he said, "I feel like a clean nigger." And what he meant was that he'd washed away the lies and he'd finally gotten right with Jesus and had told the truth. And most people believed it. Now, during his trial, whenever he got pressed on a hard question, whenever the defense lawyers really backed him into a corner, he would say, "I disremember," or "I forget," or he was very dodgy. And, like all liars, he would snowball you with a bunch of details that seemed true. And then when he got pushed into a corner, he would dodge. He would say, "I forget." He would find a convenient way of getting out of it. The one kind of larger insight I came to about Jim Conley and the truth is that sometimes the people who are telling you the truth, those are the people who are kind of awkward about it. The liars, they're really smooth. A liar has got his story down, and he really is snowing you and charming you. And, at that point, I would say, watch your wallet. The truth teller is kind of clumsy, and because the truth is clumsy, and a truth teller has nothing to hide. So a truth teller hasn't worked on a convincing story. A truth teller is just, awkwardly recalling how something happened. And Leo Frank was awkward and clumsy, and Jim Conley was a smooth operator. And so, but if you really look at Jim Conley's story, it's full of so many flat out lies. And but he was so good, he was so winning as a performer that initially the jury didn't see his lies. Anyway, the famous one, I know y'all are going to laugh, and maybe Ms. Farr has told you, there was a story about using the elevator to transport Mary Phagan's body from the supposed murder site, which was next to Leo Frank's upstairs office, to the basement where the body was actually found the next day. And Jim Conley had defecated in the bottom of that elevator shaft. And when the elevator touched the bottom of the shaft, it mashed these feces, and that disproved that Jim Conley had used the elevator, because if they had used the elevator to take her body down on the day of the murder, the feces would have been mashed that day. But it was called the shit in the shaft, and that was a big deal. The defense was able to show that Jim Conley had lied about this, and that was just one of the more colorful, or one of the more odoriferous lies. But think about it in your own life. I mean, if you have a friend who, you've had a conflict with a friend and they're telling you about why they didn't show up someplace, and they've got a story that feels kind of like it's hard to get it out of them. That story might be the truthful story, as opposed to the other friend who would say, well, we'd agreed to meet on Tuesday, not on Wednesday. You remember that. I mean, the truth tellers are often, they're stumbling, because it's you got to work to tell a lie. You got to work. It's just like working to be charming. Most of us are not naturally charming. Although I know you are, Cindy.
All right. Somebody else? All right. This is Ronnie.
Hey, Ronnie.
Hi.
Hey.
Why would everyone believe Jim Conley over Leo Frank at a time like this? Do you think it's because Leo Frank was a Jew or a Northerner?
That's a good question. I think, Leo Frank was Jewish. Leo Frank was a Yankee. And as I said, it was only 50 years after the Civil War. And Leo Frank was the boss. And, Leo Frank ran a big, big factory. And, I don't know whether any of y'all have jobs yet, whether it's working as a bag boy or girl at a grocery store, or, whatever you might do to pick up some, or just being in the school. I mean, the principal of your school, who is sort of the boss of your school, that guy or girl, woman, they have the power. So, you're a student and you're the worker in the school, and just sort of naturally rebellious, and I know you're all respectful, beautiful young Southern ladies and gentlemen in the making, but we're all rebellious and we're all slightly distrustful of the boss. And Leo Frank was the boss, and Jim Conley was just a worker. And yes, he was black, but he was just another worker. And you also have to understand that in the South at this time, the factories were kind of new. Southerners were agrarians. Most Southerners had grown up on farms or still lived on farms, and they lived a life in the cycle of the harvest and the rise of the moon, and the laying in of crops and the planting of the fields. And, that was what Southern life was about. And here in this big factory in downtown Atlanta, life wasn't like that. Life was about productivity. Life was about meeting quotas. Life was about turning out hundreds of thousands of pencils a week, coming down a conveyor belt, an assembly line. And that was all very foreign and strange. And, so Leo Frank was in charge of that. And Leo Frank was not only a Northerner and a Jew, he was an industrialist and a capitalist. He was an oddity. He had, come from another world that was very unusual and strange. And Southerners loved the fact that he was in a company that had invested in the South and had created jobs and was bringing a modern touch to their lives, but they were also distrustful and fearful. It's you all have grown up with the internet, but if you're my age, you've had to come to it late. And, I'm sure your parents or your grandparents are, slightly put off by life online and are uncomfortable with it. Well, people in Georgia were really put off in 1915 by the notion of a big factory and industry and, punching a time clock. And, Southerners were used to doing things on an altogether different cycle. And some of this, if you know older people, will make sense to you because you've seen it yourselves. And if you just keep your eyes open as you drive around Georgia and look at when you're on a 2-lane highway and see some old tenant house standing off back in a field, and you wonder about who were those people who lived there and what was their life like, and how did they put food on their table, and how did they exist? Well, they didn't work in factories. So there was a strong suspicion of Leo Frank just because he was different. and that he was Jewish made it more complicated.
All right. All right, Grace. This is Gracie.
Hey, Gracie.
Hi.
Hey.
Why did this case intrigue you so much that you spent decades of your life trying to find who killed poor little Mary Phagan?
You know, I think I need to talk to a psychiatrist about that. You know what? I just thought it was great subject matter. And, you know, as I was working on it at the time, I knew a guy who was writing a book titled The Complete Book of Darts. And he was writing a book about dart playing and everything about darts. And I thought, you know, I'd rather write a book about this very murky, complicated, important criminal case than write a book about darts. And that, you know, this was important and it was fascinating and it was interesting, and that it might last. It might, you know, show what the world was like at that time. And you know, when you're a writer, you're always looking for good stories, and that's what I do as a magazine writer. I'm always searching for good stories and fascinating people to write about and interesting topics and dilemmas. And when I looked at the murder of Mary Phagan and the lynching of Leo Frank, I thought, wow, this is a way to tell the whole story of the modern South. This is a way, and a way to do it by writing about a murder case and doing it in a way that I hope was interesting and caused people to read it because they wanted to, not because they had to. And I thought I could get at some of the deeper truths about life in the South, but I could do it in a way that was exciting and racy, because everyone's interested in a murder case. Everyone's interested in a whodunit. And I think the reason is because life is a mystery. I mean, even the people you're sitting next to in your class, your friends who you've known now, who knows how long, they're all kind of a mystery to you. You don't really know what their life is like after they go home. You don't really know exactly where they came from. You don't really know anything. Life is a mystery, and mystery stories help us illuminate life and see it a little more clearly. So I thought this was just, as I said at the outset, a double murder mystery that had these important larger ramifications, because, you know, out of the Leo Frank case came both the Anti-Defamation League, which is a New York-based group that fights anti-Semitism in America, and the revived Ku Klux Klan, which is a racist group that, you know, has mostly disappeared by 2016, but still has certain remnants when you read about skinheads and, you know, the more violent racist groups that are at large in America. So I thought, wow, this is a ground zero for a lot of the hostility and polarization in America, and yet I can write about it as a story as opposed to a textbook. So that's why I spent so long on it. That, and I get easily distracted and went off and did other things sometimes, and you know, I procrastinated like anybody else.
All right. Hi, Ethan. Don't ask about the night witching.
Hey.
Have you met any of Mary's family?
Yes. I've met her niece and namesake, Mary Phagan Keene. I've met Mary's dad. I've met Mary's older sister and or younger sister, excuse me, and they all make brief appearances in my book. They all are completely convinced that Leo Frank was guilty, and you know, as I said, there's a case to be made against Leo Frank, and the prosecution made it pretty effectively at the trial, and there are people today who still think that Jim Conley told the truth. And so So yes, I sought out everyone in Mary Phagan's family who would speak to me.
All right. Phyla? This is Phyla.
Hey, Phyla.
Hi.
Hey.
In your research, was there any newspaper that even hinted that Leo Frank was innocent?
Could you hear her?
Yes, I can hear you. Look, you all now live in this world where you get the news from Twitter or Facebook or
Snapchat.
maybe, yeah, someplace on your device. But 100 years ago, it was all about newspapers, and the most powerful newspaper in America then as now was the New York Times. And you know, much of what you read even today online probably originates at the New York Times on some level, because it's one of the only papers that really hires great reporters and pays them a living wage and lets them go do the kind of work that is original and lasting. And the New York Times took up the Leo Frank case and championed his innocence and did it on a daily basis. So the New York Times, the most important newspaper in America, editorialized in Leo Frank's favor, and the news columns were slanted in Leo Frank's favor. So, you know, it very much championed Leo Frank's innocence. And in Atlanta, the newspapers were, they played it kind of down the middle. They were very sensational. They wanted to sell papers. So, excuse me, they emphasized the wildest parts of the story, the scandal and the sexual nature of the crime. And, you know, they would do outrageous headlines. And but the New York Times was totally pro Leo Frank, and that was incredibly significant then. It would be incredibly significant now, because the New York Times is the leading newspaper in America, and it really, in many ways, still dictates what the American conversation is.
All right, we have time for one more question. Is everybody? All right. Micah, did you want to ask one? This is Micah.
Hey, Micah.
What do you find most suspicious in this case?
Everything. Well, I find it very, very suspicious that a armed group could arrive at the state prison and abduct the most famous prisoner in the prison without firing a shot, and then just drive away without anyone chasing them. I find that very, very suspicious. And someone paid off the prison guards and the warden and the officials. Someone blackmailed them, or just flat out gave them money. And I find that incredibly suspicious. Believe me, if something like this happened today, the investigation would be quick, but there was no investigation then. These guys who decided to lynch Leo Frank did it and got away with it, and then buried the crime. And to me, I find it kind of jaw-dropping. Even now, it astonishes me. And I think I got close to telling the whole story of it, but there were probably, you know, some other people involved in it that I don't fully know about, and we'll never know, because this was the kind of story that, as hard as I researched it and as many people as I talked to and as many old documents as I dug up and read, this is the kind of story that nobody was going to write down. Anyone involved in this, they didn't want people to know. They were going to hide their tracks, and they hid them pretty well. So To me, that's the most suspicious thing. How do you break into a state prison and abduct a famous prisoner and nobody investigates it? To me, that's pretty suspicious.
All right, I think we're gonna have to wrap it up. Can everybody wave? All right, say thank you.
Thank you.
All right, if we could get him maybe on the screen, and then if the students want to turn around and we'll get their picture with him for Twitter.
Stop the broadcast.
All right.
But he'll still be there.
Okay.
All right. Bye, YouTube.